In this lesson, we'll talk about applying gradients to your objects. A gradient is basically a transition from one color or one shade of a color into another. I'm going to start just by drawing a simple rectangle with the rectangle tool in the middle of my page. Then I'm going to go up to Window, Color, and select the Gradient panel to create my gradients. The Gradient panel works in conjunction with the Color and Swatch panels, so I like to have all three available to me simultaneously when I'm working. In order to do that, I'm going to pull them out of the dock, and I'm going to stack them, which I can do, open that back up, grab the color, stack them by placing one close underneath the other until I get a blue line. Once I do that, they're joined together and I can move them simultaneously. Now I'm going to grab that swatches panel and stack that below my color panel, and now I have all three stacked together. So this is my gradient slider right here. If I click on the gradient itself, you'll see it automatically applies it to my rectangle because my rectangle was selected. And you'll see three components to the gradient slider. There are two stops. That's where you set a color that will transition into the next color. And you'll also see the slider up at the top that determines the midpoint between the two colors. I can enter the location for that slider manually as well. So right now, I'm just going to set it back to 50%. I can have as many stops as I want in here, but I have to have a minimum of 2 stops to create a gradient. That means I have to have at least one color that fades into another. Otherwise, it's just a simple color. In order to apply color to these stops, I can select a color from the color panel. First, I have to select my stop. So I'm going to click on my stop. You can see that color stop is now applied to the color panel. And I can select my color from here accordingly. The other thing that I can do is I can take a color from my swatches panel, click to grab that color, drag, and drop it onto the slider, onto the gradient slider, if there are particular colors already in use in my swatches panel that I want to make sure to use when creating my gradient. If I want to add an additional color, I can just click below the slider and InDesign will create additional stops. When I click on the stop, I then have the opportunity to adjust the color of that stop. There are a couple of other settings for gradients. First of all, there are two types of gradients. A linear gradient, which fades essentially linearly from left to right or top to bottom, or at an angle, depending on which angle you set, or a radial gradient, which is circular and starts at a center. You'll notice for the radial gradient, I don't have an option to change the angle, but if I switch back to a linear gradient, I can change the angle to, say, 45 degrees, or any other in a range of 360 to change the angle of the gradient within my object. I also have this button here that allows me to reverse the order of the gradient. So basically what hitting that reverse does is it will swap the gradient on this side with the gradient on the other side. You'll see now I have my light pink here, my dark pink here. Now, if I decide that I have too many colors in my gradient, all I have to do is click those stops and just drag them off the gradient. And when I determine a gradient that I like, I can add it to my swatches panel by clicking the new swatch icon. If I double click it, it will even allow me to give that swatch a name. We'll call this one pink to black. InDesign also has a gradient tool that allows you to apply gradients to objects. So with my object selected and my gradient applied, I can then select the gradient tool, which is right here in the Tools panel. I'm going to double click this to switch to the 2-column version, which I prefer. This is my gradient tool here. It looks like a little fader from black to white. And I can click or click and drag to apply the gradient to my object. I can change the direction with the gradient tool, and I can also determine the distance of the gradient, by which I mean if I just draw a short line, you'll see that the gradient itself is just applied to this short distance, and the end stop colors, the black and the pink, are applied all the way to the edge of where I started and stopped the gradient tool. One thing that's nice for creating gradients is that I can start with a color. I'm going to grab this color from my swatches panel, throw that onto my gradient slider. If I want to create a fade of a single color, I can create a tint of that color, which I can do by grabbing the color and putting it over the new swatch icon. What that does is it allows me to create a copy of the swatch that I've already created. Then with that highlighted, I can change the tint value to, say, 20% of its original saturation. Once I do that, I can then apply that also to my gradient. My gradient has faded back here, but let's grab that. So this is my color that's now tinted to 20%. Let's apply that. And I'm going to create this as a new tint swatch. I'm going to say OK. And so now this is a value of my original swatch. I can grab that and drop that onto my gradient slider. And I can drop the blue onto my gradient slider. And I'm going to get rid of that white because it looks like it didn't quite apply it. It just put it to the side. Let's see. Apply that to the stop there. Once I get that little plus sign, I know it's being applied to the stop. I'm going to grab the blue and apply it again to that stop. I get my plus sign. Now I have my single color gradient created from a full 100% saturation to a 20% saturation using a tint swatch. In the next lesson, we'll talk a little bit about fills and strokes and how those can be how gradients and colors can be applied to fills and strokes to get the effect that you're looking for.